Clash Royale over the years has implemented dozens of balance changes and released dozens of new cards. The game has only become much more complex to a point where finding the perfect balance for some cards has been a very tricky feat. Sometimes, Supercell will release a card that may have seemed fine in the testing phase, but when implemented into the game where millions of people can try thousands of different decks and strategies, there's often things the player base finds that Supercell did not account for, leading to that card highly outperforming expectations. So today I'm going to be going back and picking 10 cards in Clash Royale that were vastly overpowered for their time, and briefly going over the circumstances behind each one for this list. Each card will only be able to make the list once I've also decided to exclude the mirror from this ranking, as it's a very difficult card to rank, given that it's just a card copier. Evolutions will also not be included on this list, so without further ado, let's start with the 10th most overpowered card in Clash Royale history. Number 10 is the July 2016 Zap. The Zap spell was a must-have during this time period for several reasons. It was the only 2 elixir spell in the game, besides the log, which had just been added at the same time as the Zapster live above. But since the log was an awful card and a legendary, making it difficult to level up, it made no difference in the Zap's performance on top of being the only viable 2 elixir spell. It was also the only card in Clash Royale, with the stun ability nowadays in Clash Royale. We have so many troops that can stun, but none of them were added yet. Lightning also had yet to receive the stun ability. This gave the card a very important purpose when dealing with cards like Sparky, because it was one of the very few cards that could completely reset its 5-second charge. Lack of competition was definitely a big factor here. The card was already the most popular card in the game, but it was buffed again in July. The buff was that it was now able to reset Inferno Towers. Before this buff, it would simply interrupt the Inferno Tower's beam instead of completely resetting it. No other buff it was given was that it would now stop. Elixir production from the Elixir Collector, and the Elixir Collector at the time was the second most popular card in the game, meaning this one-on-one interaction change made a significant difference in the meta. These buffs were just so unnecessary, they only made an overpowered card even stronger. Keep in mind, at the time, the stun lasted a full second, which is twice the amount of time it lasts today. And if all of that wasn't enough, the Zap also did more damage back then, meaning it could one-shot goblins, which is why it's no surprise that the card was used in 98 of the top 100 ladder decks. After this buff, using Zap in your deck wasn't even a second thought for top ladder players. They weren't thinking, should I include Zap in my deck? They were thinking, what 7 cards should I use with my Zap in August 2016? The card's stunt time was nerfed by half a second, and later its damage would also be decreased so that it could no longer kill goblins. Also, over the years, its Crown Tower damage stat has been nerfed several times, and unlike 2016, we have a lot of cards with the stun ability, and 5/2/2 elixir spells of which are all viable. Despite all of this, Zap still has a decent usage rate today and is far from useless. Number 9 is the March 2016 Elixir Collector. The Elixir Collector was literally free elixir. Back then, the card was only 5 elixir, pumping out 7 elixir, whereas today it costs 6 elixir and gives back 8. When it was 5 elixir, it was much more versatile and less of a commitment. So keep that in mind. But perhaps an even bigger reason for why this card was so strong was its hit points, because it had about 37% more hit points than it does today. Lightning and Rocket were already negative elixir trades on the pump, but they wouldn't even take it out. So it was a huge loss to use one of those spells on it, and using any other spell on it was an even worse trade on top of that. Miner wasn't even in the game yet, and Goblin Barrel was practically unseen since it was for elixir and was super easy to counter with a mere zap of which was the most popular spell. so hiding an elixir pump in the back was practically guaranteed value. One important thing to note is that the game has always had a disadvantaged image for the player who makes the first move in a match. Typically, you want to wait on your opponent. However, the elixir pump was the one exception, as playing this card as the first card in a match did not give your opponent an easy opportunity to play a counter and get lots of free damage, but rather forced your opponent to make a move into you so that you could get an easy positive elixir trade. You didn't have to worry about them simply using a rocket on it for an equal elixir trade while getting a ton of free damage, but this